Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Merle Massie, and I'm the coordinator for undergraduate research here at the University of Saskatchewan. And today we're going to take a little bit of a journey through writing right from the start. And of course, the play on words was deliberate on that. I'm a historian by profession, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what I really want you guys to get out of today's session is the importance of writing as a research tool. It is not just something at the end, it's a research tool, and I'm going to emphasize that as we go along. And with that, I'm going to get going. As a settler Canadian of Scottish, Irish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Ukrainian tradition, I am filled with gratitude to live within Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I give respect to the First Nations and Métis of this place and continually value our interconnectedness through Wekutuwin. I too love this land of vast skies and tall trees, Saskatoons and blueberries, and the swift and slow waters of the Saskatchewan River. As you can see, this is my personalized version of a land acknowledgement that I worked on with the University of Saskatchewan's Gwenamas Center. High recommendation if you've never had a chance to take that particular course. So who is Merle Massie? For those of you who don't yet know me, in addition to my role on campus as the coordinator for the Undergraduate Research Initiative, so one of the programs that I run is the SURE program, Student Undergraduate Research Experience, I'm also an author. And these are 4 of my books. So 36 Steps on the Road to Medicare, Forest Prairie Edge, A Radiant Life, and Inquiring Critical and Creative Spirit. That's that yellow blob sort of in the center. So I'm a Saskatchewan historian. The picture at the top is from this past winter. It's my farm, Massie Panoramic Farm. So my husband and I operate that as well. And the session today is on writing as an analytical tool, and I do that very specifically. It's going to give you some ideas of what you can do to help you throughout your research process, to guide your research process and to interact with your research process. So let's dive right in. So the typical explanation of the scientific method, particularly for those of us who are scientists, is that results is just the reporting, and it's something that happens at the end of the process. So you go through the scientific, you observe, you create your question, you've got your hypothesis, you create your experiment, you do your conclusion, and then you write up the result, as if this is something that can happen in the last 6 weeks of your project before you defend your thesis, or before you, or just, at the end of your research funding. I'm here to try and blow apart that particular framing, and to remind you that that's not actually how it works. The writing process is best when it happens all the way along. It's not just the result at the end. We write, the process of writing is an analytical tool. The earlier you start to do it, the better your work will be. Writing is about discovering and understanding what you're doing. You're explaining it to yourself and you're explaining it to others. So you're kind of doing those two things at the same time. William Zinsser said writing is thinking on paper, and or of course in your computer in the modern day. But it's the process of interaction. And so what I want to talk about today is the 5 principles of good writing. If you're looking for specific examples or ideas of how to do a lab notebook a particular way, I'm here to tell you that I cannot tell you that, simply because if you're working in a particular lab and they want you to do your lab notebook in a particular way, you need to follow their protocol. If you're working out in the field and you've got field research notes and they've asked you to do your field research notes in a particular way, you need to follow that particular structure. But within that, I want to give you some guidelines of the sorts of things that you can put into your lab journal, that you can put into your research journal, your archive journal. I'm a historian, so I always create a journal of all my work that I do in the archive and everything that I do around a particular research project. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of that. So what I've broken it down to is what I call the 5 principles of good writing, now more or less. But these are the 5 principles that I follow as a writer, and I wanted to share them with you because they are about more than just writing it up at the end. And it doesn't matter what I'm writing. It doesn't matter if I'm writing a blog post. It doesn't matter if I'm writing a book or anything in between. This is still my process. So the first is really about writing as interacting. Writing starts with interacting with your subject matter. It's being very active, very deliberate, and very critical. It's about asking questions and following your nose. So this applies to sort of everything that you're doing around your research work. So let's say at the very beginning of your research work, you've been asked to interact with a particular body of knowledge. And so you're doing essentially a literature review. So you could be acting with one journal article and kind of making notes about it going on. And I have done presentations on how to interact with a journal article, either several journal articles or one journal article. So if you want to pause and go and watch that particular session, please find it in the Sure modules on the Sure YouTube page. But as you're doing it, even in that one and in this one as well, I encourage you to critically interact and actually keep notes about that interaction, whether it's with one journal article or a whole bunch of them, and keep notes, because this is the beginning of your thought process. You're planning, you're adjusting, you're learning. You're recording. So as long as you record all the time what you're thinking about, how you reacted to that particular journal article, this whole body of knowledge, and keep a record of that interaction. So writing is an interactive tool. If you're physically in a lab or out in your field doing research, writing is also an interactive tool. So you're interacting with your research because you're recording what you did, when you did it, the time you did it, what the research protocols were, what you did with a particular Petri dish, how many Petri dishes you did today. You're keeping those active records of your methods and what you did. And it's the same if you're a historian like me and you're in the archive. What particular box did you pull out today? What did you see in that box? How did you interact with it? What did it look like? What did it smell like? All of these sorts of things that actually still are part of your research journaling, and creating that research journal, whether it's lab, field, archive, whatever it is that you're working on. So you're interacting by recording your methods. Don't assume that you're going to remember at the end of the day. You're not. Here's a secret. It's one of those things that we all think that we can do, but it's really better if you record it in the moment as much as you can. Any of your planning and ideas, it's like, this really bombed, this didn't work well, or as I was reading these particular things in the archive, it referenced something else that could open up a whole new avenue of what you might be interested in. I guarantee you won't remember a week from now. So make sure you jot that down. So sometimes what I do is that I'll take my research notebook and I'll divide it into sections, and I'll have a section that's on sort of literature review kinds of stuff. I'll have a section that's all about my methods, what I accessed, when I accessed it, how I interacted with it. So my methods. Then I usually have a section that's sort of cool ideas that came up, that I might want to look at, or that might do something in the end, or I don't have time to look at it now, but in 3 weeks time, I'm going to have a lull and I want to look at it. Write that down so that you can refresh your memory and get back to what you were thinking in that moment. This is also where you're adjusting on the fly. For those of you who are actively doing research right now, you'll know that research is never a straight path. And so you're interacting with what you're doing. You're recording your data points. And then as you go through your analysis, you might go back and you're like, oh my God, something really, really strange is going on here. So writing is interacting. You're recording what you're doing simply because you want to make sure that you're capturing all of those thoughts as you're going along. So asking questions during the research and the writing process. So here's something that I wanted to be very clear on. Active recording, writing, and interacting with what you're doing is part of both your research process, and it helps your research process and it helps to guide you. So that's that lab notebook and so on and so forth. But it's also going to be part of your writing process later. Those same notes that you take are actually going to be a huge step forward when you go down to if you have to go and write it up afterward. So bring yourself to your research. This is something that students tend to be quite scared about and fearful about. You are actually the critical difference between what you're studying and what everyone else has had to say about it. You are the one interacting with it. You're bringing all of your previous knowledge, or you're bringing all of your naivety. You have no knowledge of this particular area and you're interacting with it for the first time. That is also valuable because you might be the person who sees the holes in a different way, or who brings what knowledge you have maybe from a completely different class, and all of a sudden you're going to be the one that changes new directions or adds new directions to your lab, to the research process, even to the, I've seen it happen even into to change your professor's whole direction. And I've seen that come from an undergraduate student's very simple questions like, why don't we do it this way? What? Never thought of that. And away you go. So don't be afraid if you don't know anything. You're still there's value to not knowing because you might bring fresh eyes. When you're actively asking questions, you're bringing yourself to the research. So that, what did you do? Why did you do it that way? Record that too. What happened? So obviously your data, like these were the results, but also did you forget to turn on a machine? Did you turn on a machine and accidentally leave it on for 12 hours, but something miraculous happened? Sometimes that happens too. What did you think about it? What did you do to problem solve? If there's technical issues or a machine or instrumentation isn't working properly, what were the problem solving and what did you do in that moment to change it? And also, as you're interacting with your research and recording things as you're going along, you might be making changes as you go along, and that's important too. So this picture is really about note-taking, and that's recording all of your interactions with your research. And again, you take notes on everything you do. If you read an article, you're taking notes on the article. You read a bunch of articles, you're taking notes on all of them, and then you start to compare them. You're conducting research, take notes on what you're doing, how you set it up, what machine you used, what archival documents you're reading, everything. Now, how you take notes is up to you. I have seen students use their computer and take notes in their computer or have a document that way. I've seen them do it in Excel, which also works well. I've seen them actually take physical notes and have a book of some kind like mine here. Sorry, you probably can't see it and I'm going to confuse because I've got a screen in the background, but have a book and have sections in your book for these sorts of things. How you take your notes is up to you, as long as you're within the guidelines of your lab or your research group. And do what feels normal for you. Do whatever way is going to be the easiest for you, because you need to be taking notes all the time and you need to be incredibly diligent. When you interact with your research every day, and not waiting till the end of the day and not waiting till the end of the week, when you interact with your research and record your thoughts as you go along, you're miles and miles forward in the end, because you can't wait till the end of the day or the end of the week. You will miss things. If you're out in the field and you literally can't record stuff for whatever reason, torrential downpour, something like that, do the best you can with what you've got, but try and take your notes in the moment if you can. So your note-taking is actually the beginning of your analysis. Because you're interacting with what you're doing, you're also analyzing as you go along. So you make notes on everything you read, everything you did, everything you thought. It's active reading, asking questions. Who wrote it? When? Why? Who funded it? So if you're reading an article, what were they responding to? What was the research question? What was their hypothesis? And then turn that lens on yourself. Why am I doing this research? What am I looking for? What am I hoping for? What am I responding to? What's my research question? Has that changed? What's my hypothesis? Has that changed? These sorts of things. And again, methodology, findings, that's your data plus your analysis. Again, that back and forth interaction and your conclusion. Does it make sense? Like, okay, the data says this. Does that actually make sense? Do you believe it? Or do you think that maybe there's something wrong with how you captured that data? So that interaction is a massive part of the research process. What unanswered questions do you have? This is always the steps forward, and again, that analysis to think through, like, oh, this seems really out there. This seems very strange. I need to check this again. But here's the thing, is about being confident. Confidence is the key. Yes, you can ask questions. Yes, you can ask questions of yourself, which is not self-doubt. That's part of the research process, is checking in on yourself and making sure that you understand what you're doing and that others can as well. And yes, you can be skeptical. Yes, you can critique. You can critique in a good way. Other people in your lab, you can critique the larger research project. You can critique yourself and your colleagues, or critique how you're doing things. Bringing yourself and having that very highly engaged, interactive process that you're recording as you go along adds a huge amount of strength. Then that way you can go back and you can use your notes to pinpoint. Let's say that that your lab work produces some really strange results. If you've been recording what you've done all the way along, you can go back and you can figure out where things went off the tracks or went into a really good track. So yes, keeping notes, most important. The reason why I say write all the way along and don't wait until the end is because when you interact with your research every day, everything that you write, even if it's just data points or plans for the next day, or, oh my God, this was weird, you know, what happened here? All of that, the more writing you do, the better your analysis will be and the better your argument will be. The more you interact with what you're doing, the better you'll understand it, and your analysis and your writing will be better for it. And your writing will mature and it will grow more sophisticated throughout the project. It's like, let's say that you have an established set of protocols that you've written up sort of once in your research journal. As long as you know that you're following those protocols exactly the same, maybe you don't need to capture that every single day. Capture it if you've changed something, capture it if you forgot something accidentally, capture those sorts of things. But if you have a set of protocols that you know that you're going to be following every day and you've kind of got that set and established, maybe that allows you more time for that more interactive writing, asking questions, wondering where the next steps in your research might be. So your writing will mature, and your ability to take good notes in your journal, in your research journal, will grow and change slightly throughout the project, and that's okay too. But one of the best things about your notes, your research notes, is that they will flow into your finished product. So a poster, if you've been asked to produce a poster and you're going to enter the Sure Summer Symposium, if you've been asked to co-author a paper with your supervisor, or you're writing one yourself, you're giving a presentation to your lab mates, you're giving a presentation to a conference, your notes that record those interactions are actually going to be a huge time saver for you later on. Now, we're going to take a little pause here. I wanted to show you, oops, I skipped over it. So I published a book on Sylvia Fedoruk, who was a USask researcher, a female researcher in the Department of Physics in the late 1940s, early 1950s. She later went on to become the first female chancellor of the University of Saskatchewan and the first female lieutenant governor of Saskatchewan. So Sylvia's her physics lab notebooks are actually part of her archival collection. And so when I was doing research on her, I actually got to access her research notes, her lab notebook, from her world-changing research work. This is actually one of the first pictures of what became on the left is the Cobalt 60 machine, which is now in the Western Development Museum at the in Saskatoon. So that actual machine that you see in the picture is in the Western Development Museum in Saskatoon, and that's Sylvia showcasing how to work it. But on the left, you'll see a picture that came right out of her lab notebook when they were first figuring out what they wanted the Cobalt 60. So this is for cancer treatment, just in case you don't know. This is the first time that we captured Cobalt 60 for use to actually treat cancer in people's bodies. So this was the clinical model that they built. It was built in Saskatoon, and they used these diagrams to kind of hash out what they were doing. And there's more sophisticated diagrams as well, but this is one of the first ones. So this is an example of the sorts of things that you can capture in your research notebook. And you can see that she's got mathematical things going on as well. And this is just the front. So her physics, her notebook of all of her research, then of course came to form her master's thesis research. And so it's Yes, it's archival, so I'm a historian, so I access it this way. But that's another thing that you should know, is that the lab notebooks that you keep, maybe ask a question of your supervisor as to do they want the lab notebooks to stay as part of the lab, or are these something that you get to keep and take with you as you go along, or do they need a copy of it? That might make a difference between do you take it physically, or do you maybe keep research notes on a computer log that then get shared with the whole lab. So these are some questions that you can ask. But I just wanted to show you this just as a break, to think through why lab notebooks matter, not just for your research project, but also for a larger research project. Let's say that you're contributing to people's learning going forward. And sometimes they can even end up in an archive and help a historian 50 or 100 or 200 years later. So just keep that in mind. So next up this is about taming the chaos, so creating order. Again, this sort of moves past that interaction into where you start to do sort of analytical work with your data, with your research project. It's also, we might be moving a little bit more towards what happens when you actually start to get towards the end of your project and you're writing it up. And sorry, I put that in research quotes. I find writing magic because it harnesses the energy created by the chaos within. That's from Linda Gray. I really like that quote. But truly, most of the time, we're the one on the left, which, like, we've got so much data and so much information, and we're just buried, and we're like, oh my God, what do we do now? So that is a thing. So actually, to tame the chaos and create order, one of the first things to learn is when to stop researching, when to stop looking, and when to stop writing, actually. So learning when to stop researching is a skill set, but here's a couple of things that you can use to maybe that help you give clues. If your head is full, if you completely had enough, you need to stop and you need to go do something else. So when you're feeling overwhelmed, that's one of your cues. If you've exhausted all of your leads, so you've come to the end of your research road, then yeah, that's a time to stop. If you start finding all the same information, or you've replicated your research project several times, and you've got a very robust data set that actually you were able to replicate, and you're finding all the same information, that's called saturation. And that actually applies in a literature search as well. So that's another signal that it's time to stop. And also, frankly, when you're out of time. The one secret about research that people worry about, and this is one of the reasons why master's and PhD students can sometimes go on for too long, is because they get stuck in the research phase. Because they think that someone is going to be checking up on them. But really, you can stop the research when you've hit any of these points, and basically when you're out of time, and just say, look, and just time, research can be time bound. You can say, we ran out of time, we had to stop and write it up. This was all that we could do within the time that we had. That is a perfectly legitimate reason to stop researching. So make sure that you are clear on that. When you're saturated, when you're out of time, when you're exhausted, when your head is full, stop. One of my favorite things about that interactive process with your research are the aha moments. So do your best, if you can, to stop and take the time, spend a little bit of extra time on your aha moments. They might be just an aha moment to you, which is fine, but sometimes they're an aha moment for that larger research and the progression of the research. So anytime that you interact with what you're doing and you're really active and you're asking those questions and you're capturing your thoughts, what surprised you? What's unique? What really caused you to stop and think? These are your aha moments. Sometimes over the course of a research project, there might be 2 or 3 or even 4. And what are your most important things? And what's your evidence? That's the other thing. You might have some aha moments that are kind of fascinating, but if you don't say why they're aha moments and back it up with evidence, they won't have as much impact. So make sure that if you have an aha moment, make sure that you're capturing why it's an aha moment. So be sure that you've got both. What's your evidence? And also, for those aha moments, flip it around. What's your strongest argument against those aha moments? What are the limitations of that? I thought it was an aha moment, but maybe it's only because these were the parameters. So make sure that you're always paying attention to those holes and gaps and paths forward. So yes, an aha moment, but say why it's an aha moment. Also, how about taming the chaos and creating order? This is a really good time to actually start creating an outline, creating a skeleton or a guide. You can actually, some people, again, this comes from that, I'm going to write it up at the end. You can actually start writing a paper or start your poster right from day one. I promise you, you can. You've got maybe week 1, week 2, but still right from the beginning. So you can actually build an outline, and sometimes there's a syllabus or there's lab guides that they want you to do things in a particular way. If you're going to be writing a research article, the journal might have particular rubrics or guidelines of things that they want to see in introduction, methods, results, conclusion, these sorts of things. Or if you're doing if you're going to be creating a research poster, there's sort of some available rubrics that give you some outlines and some guides and things that you can start populating right from the beginning. So what did you study? What's the context? What was your big unknown? Your research question. So you can kind of start to capture your thoughts and divide them up a little bit and conquer it through an outline. What's your research question? What did you do? Well, that's your methods, right? So at any point, if you're at a point in your research where you can start to capture these sorts of things and writing down what your methods were and your research question, by all means, take the time to do it, because then that's going to save you time later when you go to write it up, as you say. What did you find? Of course, that's your results, that's your evidence. And what did you think about your findings? So that's your analysis using your evidence. And again, you can start this right from the beginning. And what are your conclusions? And you'll find that there's bits and pieces of that, but if you're aware of all of these questions, it will actually change and shape and allow you to bring a bit of order to all of that chaos of everything that's going around you. So high recommendation at some point to sit down, decide what your output is going to be for your project, and do a little bit of divide and conquer. Create an outline and know that you have to sort of populate things in each of these areas. That will help you enormously. And you can do that in your lab notebook or your research notebook as well. So then the next part, so this is step 3 of my research process and my writing process, is to really think hard about the story that you're telling and build that narrative. So this is kind of taking all those like 1,000 puzzle pieces and actually putting it together. And so this is always that, when you're putting a puzzle together, you've got that guide where you sort of have an idea of what the larger picture is going to look like, but you're busy focusing in on little bits and pieces. So maybe the outside of the puzzle, if you're like me, I always do the outside of the puzzle first so that I've kind of got it bounded. To me, that's the outline. There's your outline. You know where your structure is. And then you've got maybe some different, you've got the yellow stuff, that's the duck, and the blue stuff, that's the pond, and the green stuff, that's the tree, or whatever it is. And so you can kind of sort things and know where it's going to go next, or know where it belongs. I always do the easiest stuff first. Sometimes that's your project name and who helped you with it, and then drafting that outline. Again, I consider that to be sort of the outline of the puzzle. And then as I'm building this, or as I'm building my narrative and what this picture is going to look like, what the story is going to look like, then I know I do the easy, I don't know if you do a puzzle this way, but I always do the easiest stuff first, and like, okay, now I'm going to attack this section, and I'm going to attack this section. And then, the really tough stuff is sort of at the end, but it does help you to identify your holes and gaps. Again, it's going back to that number 1, that interactive process. As you're building your picture, and I've done this even when I'm writing books, and including my PhD thesis. As I was writing my thesis, I realized that I had 2 whole chapters that I needed to stop, go back, and make sure that I had good research on, and that my argument would flow, because I realized and that was during the writing process, which I did right from the beginning, right? So that's how come I could help to identify those holes and gaps. So writing is part of your analytical process because it helps you identify your holes and gaps. So just giving you a heads up on that. Another way to identify and what you're doing isn't just the writing, it's actually the visuals as well. So I'm a historian, so I tend to use photos, but a lot of you are scientists, so you're going to be creating charts, you're going to be creating graphs, visuals of that sort of thing. We do have a session coming up this summer, which are, in fact, it's 2 sessions. One is about how to tell a story with visuals, and that's coming up in July. I believe it's about July 13th or so, something 12th or 13th. And then the following week, there's a follow-up about, if you've got charts and visuals and graphs, how to make them pretty, how to make them really flow and make them really clear. So if you are working with visuals at all this summer, if you're going to be creating some charts and graphs from your data and research, high recommendation to jump in on those sessions. We've set them in July because we know that it's going to take you some time to generate the data that you need to create your charts and graphs. So for me, a picture is worth 1,000 words. That's an old saying, but it's about telling your story a different way. Images, charts, and graphs can be a very quick and fast representation of what you're talking about that's way shorter than using words. And so high recommendation to include a lot of charts, graphs, and visuals in what you do. It also helps you think about your data in new ways. Oftentimes you only find the holes in your data when you've charted it and graphed it and you've got a whole bunch of strange outliers and you can't make sense of it. So creating the visuals helps you see your data in a different way, and then you know that you've got a problem and you can go back and work on it. It also shortens and tightens your narrative. So let's say that you're going to be giving a presentation or building a poster. Charts and visuals will just shorten and tighten. You can put an awful lot of information into a visual. When you're building that narrative, and this is something that me as a historian hurts my soul, but I do it all the time. And it's a writing prompt called "Kill Your Darlings." What that basically means is that you have to learn to cut what you realize doesn't belong. And I'm not just talking about outliers, but let's say that you did have an interesting sort of side direction at some point in your research, and you realize that, yeah, it's interesting, but it doesn't actually answer the question that I'm looking to answer right now. So you need to cut it. You need to cut it even if you love it. Even if you think it's amazing, you need to have a file or put it somewhere in your lab notebook where you can pick it up later. It's like, oh yeah, that was awesome. I want to investigate that. So you need a cut from project file. Never ever delete anything that you've created. But sometimes you might need it for extra evidence, counterpoint, or as I said, as part of the path forward. This is a new research idea that you had while you were interacting with what you were doing in this sentence or in this case. Oftentimes it can become seed for another research project. So really this is about, you're shaping the project that you're working on, but those bits that you take out might be the start of something else altogether. So kill your darlings, but don't kill them forever. Just like kill them in terms of this project. All right. Rule number 4 is the first audience is you. So you need to explain it to yourself first. This is a principle that I use all the time, both in my research and in my writing. Sometimes it takes longer than other times because sometimes I don't understand, especially when I'm reading something highly theoretical, I get lost in literature reviews and I get confused and I read the same paragraph 3 times and what's going on here and I don't understand. So taking the time to explain it to yourself first is absolutely critical. And these 2 things go together. If you understand it, then you can explain it. So do you understand what it says? So when you're explaining it to yourself first, you're always constantly asking yourself, do I understand what's going on? Lab notebooks and research notes tend to be quite personal because you're interacting with your research. And so your research is growing and changing every day. You as a researcher are growing and changing every day. You're bringing yourself to what you're doing. But still, if you don't understand it, get help. Make sure that you talk with your lab mates, talk with your supervisor, go read a few more journal articles to help you understand what you're doing. If you can write it to explain it to yourself, that's actually the first step. Because if you write it and you understand it, if you write it and you don't understand it, nobody else is going to understand it either. So that's your first problem. So choose simple words. When people understand you the first time, you sound smart. So next week we have, or within a couple of weeks, we've got a plain language workshop with Jill McMillan, and science. It's about science writing made easy. High recommendation for that particular workshop, because people sometimes think that when you write and you confuse people, you sound smart. But actually the opposite is true. So the most cited journal articles are the ones that you read and you understand the first time you read it. And those people, even if it's something very simple, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. You know, where was this, you know, before? If you don't understand it, it's going to be really hard to explain it to someone else. And that's your perfect example. If you read something and you don't understand it, they're not doing a good job communicating to you. So if you can explain it to yourself, that's the first step, because then you can use those explanations to build your reports and your posters and your presentations. One of the things that people do, especially if they're only talking to people inside their lab, is that they assume that people know what you did, what you thought, and what you're trying to say, but they don't always. And so clarity matters. And so I've got a couple of more suggestions of ways to really bring clarity and to be able to explain it to yourself and to others. So a couple of more thoughts. Number one is reading it out loud. Now, you might feel silly reading your lab notes out loud, and I get that. So you might want to save this for when you're actually writing things up and you're trying to write a journal article, or you're trying to write a poster, or you're trying to write a presentation for a conference, even an oral presentation, and you're writing it out. This is an exceptional way to catch mistakes in written work, but it actually works quite well in a lab group. Orally explain what you did to your colleagues and get their feedback to make sure that you're explaining it well and that they don't have any questions. You'll be shocked by what you catch. It happens to me all the time. I explain things to my husband and sometimes to my 20 and 22-year-old children, and it's phenomenal. The concept of communication is a two-way street, and for me to make sure that I really understand what I want to say and that I know what I did. So, and if you're tripping up or they're confused, go back and fix what either you didn't understand or what you've missed. And so you can read things to yourself and listen, or you can read things to others. So that's another suggestion. I guess really what I'm trying to get at is that revision is part of both the research process and the writing process. So that interactive going back and checking what you did is part of the research process. And you're going back and you're kind of, okay, I did this, and then this happened, and this happened, and I don't really know why. Okay, you need to go back and think about that. Like this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and it makes sense for these reasons. So revising and explaining to yourself is part of that interactive research process. It's also part of the writing process. It's an exceptional way to catch mistakes on your own within yourself. But the next best thing is to ask a friend. Now, I've already talked about lab mates and about, you know, having those conversations with your lab mates, or even giving presentations to people within your research group. But it's also a really good idea to ask a friend not in your lab or research group to listen to your research and read it over for you, or even better, ask more than one. Now, this is where the SURE program might actually be of benefit to you. If you can reach out and find an undergraduate student or a graduate student in another lab doing something totally different, who's willing to share some time with you, and maybe you can offer it back by way of return and just say, yeah, absolutely. Can you read my poster and I'll read yours and we'll discuss it. That's super, because you want someone who's got maybe a little bit of a knowledge of how research works, or how just in general, rather than your grandma, for example. But at the same time, you don't want to get someone who's too close to you, because they might be filling in the gaps on their own. And so they're not catching them for you because they know the process too well. So that's why asking someone beyond your lab is a really good idea. It actually makes your research stronger, as well as any research writing, your poster, your presentation, your report, your journal article. I see this every once in a while. Some of you might be working on a group project Make sure that everyone in the group understands everything, even if you've kind of hived it off and you're responsible for this and you're responsible for this and you're responsible for this. Make sure that everyone in your group actually understands what's happening and why it happened the way that it did. So just a small aside. And if you do have a friend not in your lab that you've asked to check things, ask them not just to check your writing or listen to you orally, but actually to look at your visuals as well. Any of the visuals that you've created as a part of your research work, have them check those as well and look at them. And then, you know, you can edit, fix anything that comes up. All right. When you're explaining things to yourself and asking people for response, the next thing might be the hardest, and that's accepting their feedback and direction. I know this, it's hard. I have a recommendation for you. And again, this is where your lab notebook or your research or your field notes will come in. Record that feedback and any direction or ideas or issues where people had sticking points. Record that in your lab notebook and your research journal. Break it down and analyze that feedback. Now, not all of it is always relevant. Maybe they missed the point, but if they did, record that so you can make sure that you go back and when you explain it again, you make that point more clear. If they misinterpreted something, record that too, so that you can explain it differently next time or address whatever feedback makes your work better. So basically, you always want to submit work in progress for review with your supervisor, always, of course, number one, with your lab mates, always. That always helps as well. But if you can find someone that you trust within the university environment who's outside your lab, maybe check in with them as well. It really does help your research. And then basically just accept that feedback and direction. Don't take it personally. Everybody misses stuff. Everybody understands their stuff so well that they stumble over to explaining it to someone else. It happens all the time. But if you revise and resubmit, then you might even want to take it back to them. It's like, is this better? Does that make sense this time? But the biggest part of that is to build time into your research to do this. Don't leave things to the last minute. That's why I recommend starting your research journal, starting your lab notes right on day one, keeping it going as you're going along, using that as your base to kind of check in with other people, and building in the time to accept that feedback and direction and reapply it to whatever you're doing, whether it's your research, you've gone in a weird direction and they want to put you back on track, or if it's something in your writing itself and you need time to edit it and fix it. So that's all number 4. We're going to move on to sort of my 5th principle of research and writing, and that is letting it go into the world. And you'll see that I'm putting accepting feedback and criticism again in this section, and the reason for that is that there's what you do sort of as your research is going and accepting that feedback and direction and maybe changing your research. But then there comes a point when you are actually at the end of your research, you're presenting it to public and you aren't going back in to change anything. So it's a different kind of feedback and criticism. So it's sort of that really public facing interaction, but it's still a huge part of the research process. It may not be you going back in and making changes to the research, but maybe people within your lab or your research group will be accepting that feedback, and maybe that feedback from outside the university or outside the people that you've already checked in with may make some suggestions that might be actually, maybe they've published a journal article that's actually kind of similar to what you've done and they went in a totally different direction. That's actually also feedback as well. So it's a huge part of the research process, presenting at a conference, speaking to your lab mates, showcasing a poster, any of it. So I broke this let it go into the world kind of thing into a few application bits. Number 1 is actually submit, and learning when a piece of research is finished enough. No research is ever perfect, but finished enough to move on to something new. That's part of this. It doesn't mean that you're abandoning it. It just means that particular portion of your research is done. The first thing to Accept is that no research and no piece of writing is ever perfect. The perfect is the enemy of the good. So if you can learn to accept imperfection, that is going to go a long way to building your resilience as a researcher. So I can't really emphasize that enough. It's really important. When you're submitting, you need to let it go. It doesn't mean abandoning it. It just means that you're changing the focus. The next thing that you're going to do is going to be a little bit different. It's going to start a little different. It's going to be shaped a little bit different. It's also how we find new paths forward. Accepting that imperfection is part of the new research directions. Write down the mistakes and the oopses that you did as part of the process. When I was researching Sylvia Fedoruk, and in her lab notebook, she had to put some tin around this one. She was working with an apparatus and she had to use some tin, and it was clearly too much. So she kept paring away at it and paring away at it. And she had to do that every day for multiple days. And you could see how frustrated she was with that, because she was actually using different, like she dropped into a different language. She started using German and Ukrainian and all kinds of other languages, because she was just so frustrated with this particular part of the process of getting her apparatus to work properly. But that's part of the research process as well, and that's the imperfection. She actually had a huge disaster happen one year, and I'll tell you that story. And a whole summer's worth of research, because her apparatus wasn't working properly, all of the data from her entire summer of research, her supervisor took one look at it at the end of the summer, and he literally picked it up and threw it into the garbage can. Can you imagine something like that happening? I know it freaks me out that she had the resilience to continue even after that happened, but she did. But that's also part of the research process. That's how they knew that they needed to spend more time fixing their apparatus and making sure that their apparatus was working properly, so that then they could do the research, record the data, and that the data would actually be able to say something. Because they spent the time on that, her data, so what she published on was what we call the depth dose. So that machine that I showed you, she researched how to set it to get the maximum amount of cancer fighting X-ray work, cobalt-60 work, at the correct depth inside a person's body to actually hit the cancer, depending on where the cancer was in the body. It's called depth dose. It's only like 44 pages long. It was her master's thesis, and it was published as tables all over the world. And everybody who used cobalt-60 to treat cancer around the world, and there are still places around the world that use cobalt-60 because it's cheap to treat cancer, they still use Sylvia's depth dose data that she calibrated in 1951. But that's because she spent so much time making sure that her stuff was calibrated properly. So there's your story for the day. There was lots of imperfection before she finally got to something that was useful worldwide. So part of letting it go into the world is accepting critique, which is tough, but you need to do it. Accepting praise, which is actually also tough, but you need to do it. And to learn from both. What can you learn? What can you work on next time? What did you do well? What should you do again? What was and what should you absolutely never do again? All of that is part of your research journey as well. And when you record that in your journal, it actually gives you both things to work on and things that you did well. So, you know, if you're having a really tough day, go to the section of your research journal where you're like, oh, this was all the stuff I did well, or the stuff that I figured out and it helped everybody in the lab. Record that stuff too, because you'll need it on the tough days. So this is sort of the last sort of area that I want to talk about. If you've caught the research bug from doing a research project and you've been building your research journal, you've been recording those aha moments, you've been recording your weird ideas as you've been going along, you've been recording your basic data, you've been graphing things, you've been interacting with your data, you've got your lab notes, then you've got plenty of ideas for where you can go next. It builds your research and your writing skills. You're building new knowledge in the world, so you are contributing, and this is amazing work. Where can you build on this research? Where could this research go next? Or, no, I am never touching bees again. I am going to go do research on rocks. That's perfectly reasonable to know that too. So yeah, wherever your research goes, the more you interact with it, the better it's going to be. Okay, so we're going to review those 5 principles of good writing and good research. Writing of these, so writing is interacting, that is number 1, and it's the most important. The more you interact with your project and record that interaction in whatever format works for you or whatever format your supervisor wants you to use, that's the secret of good research. Do not wait until the end to write it up. You're interacting with your research and you're recording that interaction as you go along. Then you start to tame the chaos and create some order. Then you're building your story, you're building your narrative, and you're shaping what belongs, what doesn't belong. This belongs and this needs more exploration. This doesn't fit, this goes to the side. Then you're interacting in a way to explain it to yourself first. Explain it to yourself so that you can explain it to others. Check in with others. Make sure, oh, I missed that part. Gee, I thought everybody knew that. No, okay, I guess I need to explain that. And keep going until you've got a narrative that's strong, that you can take out and share with the public, whether it's that a research snapshot, a poster, a conference, a presentation, oral presentation, a written journal article, it doesn't matter what it is. Explain it to yourself, explaining to the people around you, check with someone outside that, and then with that interaction, you can let it go, number 5, out into the world and publish it, present it. When you write to discover and to understand and keep the record of that journey all the way along, interaction with your project and recording that, then you are writing right from the start. And that is the end of my presentation. And I'm going to end the slideshow and I am going to stop sharing and take any questions and comments that you guys have. And I will actually stop the recording as well, just so that I don't want any of you to feel like you need to worry. Actually, you're not showing up on Zoom, and you won't anyways, the way Zoom works. All right. Any questions, comments, thoughts? This might not have been quite what you were looking for. You might have been wanting, like, how do I break down my lab journal? Sorry. When I'm speaking across the whole campus, I cannot tell you how to do that because that's disciplinary specific. But I can give you a nudge to write everything and to interact with what you're doing and keep a record all the way along. And believe me, I wish that I had done a better job of this for every single project that I've ever done. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself and just ask.